Hello and welcome to this third episode in our 2021 SASB Standards Implementation webinar series. Today, how investors use your ESG disclosures. I'm Neil Stewart with the Value Reporting Foundation, speaking to you from New York.
And then Marie Monette, Senior Director Responsible Investment at PSD Investments, speaking to you from Montreal.
And I'm Bruno Bertacci. I'm head of the Sustainable Equity Investment Team at UBS Asset Management.
And I'm Katie Schmitz-Hewlett, Director of Investor Relationships at the Value Reporting Foundation, speaking to you from San Francisco.
Welcome to our audience from around the world, more than 2,800 registrants, representing upwards of 30 countries. The single largest group, sustainability consultants, followed closely by corporate sustainability officers. Both roles really catalysts in the decision to adopt SASB standards and the subsequent implementation process. We also have investors, accounting professionals, academics, or students and legal officers, as well as investor relations officers with us. We started out in session 101, going back to the origins of SASB standards and studying the industry-specific financial impacts of ESG factors with Bank of America and BASF. Last week in session 201, we looked at the corporate journey with Lockheed Martin and ABN AMRO from the Netherlands. Both webinar videos are available if you missed them. We're going to wind up next week on June 29th with a look at disclosure quality, including internal governance and controls, as well as external assurance. Today, our focus is on investors, exploring why investors want companies to use SASB standards for investor-focused ESG disclosure, and how they use the resulting disclosures in their investment and stewardship processes. This will help companies to build the case for SASB standards adoption and to better meet the needs of investors. As with the previous episodes, a recording of today's webinar with the slides will be made available to all registrants. Look for an email after the event. We invite you to submit your questions throughout the program. We're going to take as many as possible. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And we're focused on SASB standards implementation. So I'm sorry if we don't have time to respond to other questions that might not be on that topic. Now, next, I'm going to be joined by my colleague, Katie Schmitz-Hewlett. Katie was among the first staff members of SASB a decade ago, and now Director of Investor Relationships and lead for our APAC outreach. And Katie co-founded and leads our investor advisory group for the SASB standards. We're going to do a quick round of 8 questions that were amongst the most commonly or frequently asked in last week's session 101. Katie, you're first up. A question for you. Will SASB standards change now that you have merged with the IIRC? Will the materiality principles change to fit the integrated reporting framework criteria?
Thanks, Neil. So SASB standards will not be changing. They're among 3 offerings of the Value Reporting Foundation, which include the principles of integrated thinking, the integrated reporting framework, and then the SASB standards. The standards will continue to be set according to the principles, processes, and practices outlined in SASB's conceptual framework and our rules of procedure. The SASB Standards Board, an independent board that is accountable for the due process and outcomes and ratification of the SASB standards, will continue to play the same role as they've done previously.
Great, thank you, Katie. I'll take the next one. This is kind of the flip side of that question. Will the integrated reporting framework shift under the Value Reporting Foundation? So we're prioritizing a technical program to look at key concepts and really the architecture in the reporting landscape, and including the materiality determination process by businesses, incorporating sustainability issues into integrated reports. So through this process, as well as the work that we're undertaking with the IFRS Foundation as members of the Technical Readiness Working Group, we will be best placed to understand how to further align the SASB standards and integrated reporting framework to simplify their use by preparers. Katie, back to you. And do you recommend that SASB reporters move to integrated reporting?
So the integrated reporting framework and SASB standards will remain complementary tools. However, we intend to align the integrated reporting framework and SASB standards more closely over time. There's already very good alignment, but it's not necessarily well known to others. So while the Value Reporting Foundation will provide guidance on how to use both together, we expect organizations to use the standards and/or frameworks that best suit their needs.
Okay, now let me take a very common question we get asked about TCFD alignment with SASB. And this question is, does TCFD overlap with SASB? That's the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And this questioner said they had noticed that in the TCFD recommendations, it says fulfillment is possible with SASB alignment. And yes, they are complementary tools as well. The TCFD implementation guide that we produced offers a practical how-to guidance for companies to use the SASB standards, as well as the CDSB framework, that's the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, to take the TCFD recommendations from principles to practice. Katie, over to you. And if a company operates in several industries, how can they find the right SASB standards that fit them? Should they select and report on different SASB standards in different industries that match their business?
Great. Each company is really best suited to determine the standards which are most relevant according to the 6 industry classification of our Sustainable Industries Classification System. We recommend reviewing multiple industry standards to identify topics beyond those defined by your primary industry classification in that system and the standard related to it. And you may want to disclose to investors using more than one standard. So we recommend checking out the SASB implementation primer to learn more about that.
Great. Now, last week, when we were looking at the corporate journey, we made a lot of references to the SASB standards application guidance. And a simple question we got was, where can we find the standards application guidance? And it is available or offered for download at the same time as you download a SASB standard itself. So just go download SASB standard or standards that apply to your company, and you will be offered the application guidance there as well. It's a single document that spans all 77 standards, very concise 4-page guide to conforming with the SASB standards. Katie, we get this question a lot, and should the external auditors be involved in the implementation of a company's SASB disclosures? That is the question about assurance here.
Yes, so we recommend strong systems of internal control around the compilation and disclosure of sustainability related information. And we have much more on this in our standards implementation primer that we've previously referred to. Many companies are choosing to have their their disclosure assured and audited, but it's really up to each company to determine whether or not that they're ready for that, depending on where they are in their disclosure journey.
Great. Now, last question, a quick one. Will the FSA certification change with add-ons from integrated reporting framework? So the FSA, the Fundamentals of Sustainability Analysis, a certification that SASB standards administer, it will not be changing in light of the merger. The existing content already covers the integrated reporting framework as part of the reporting journey, and existing credential holders will not be affected by the merger. Katie, thanks for helping me field this quick fire round. Now I'll go on to the first segment of our webinar proper, and that's a conversation with Anne-Marie Monette. Anne-Marie, maybe we could start off with just introducing PSP and your role there. Tell us about the institution and what you do there.
Absolutely. So for members of the audience who may not be familiar with PSP Investments, we are a Canadian Crown corporation established in 1999, responsible for managing funds and pensions for the public service employee, the Canadian Forces, Reserve Force, and Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We have just over 900 employees and crossed the 200 billion assets under management line as of our most recent financial statements in Canadian dollar terms. My role at PSP, I'm Senior Director Responsible Investment and also support ESG integration across our public market asset classes, which includes our corporate governance, so proxy voting and engagement activities, as well as the ESG integration for both internally managed and externally managed investments.
Well, it's great to have PSP representing the kind of the pension community and Canada, managing the Mounties retirement assets. It's fantastic. As a pension fund manager and an asset owner, so as a pension fund, what is PSP's motivation for and your approach to integrating ESG?
So perhaps starting at eye level with our mandate, PSP's investment mandate is really to manage the funds transferred to it by the government of Canada in the best interest of beneficiaries and contributors, with a view to achieve a maximum rate of return without undue risk of loss. So it is crucial for us as long-term investors to integrate ESG analysis into our investment due diligence and asset management processes. Our responsible investment approach is aligned with our mandate, and essentially is anchored on an investment belief that integrating, identifying, monitoring ESG considerations is material to long-term performance, and our framework is also takes into consideration and very aligned with ESG materiality. So we monitor material ESG risk and opportunities throughout the investment life of investments across all our asset classes.
And in terms of some of the techniques you use, integrating KPIs and building portfolios, how does, including SASB standards, how does some of the tools that you use inform your internal portfolios, as well as perhaps due diligence around external managers?
Sure. Good question. So essentially, it's important for us to have consistency across asset classes and how we look at ESG integration. So our approach is really based on the materiality of ESG risk and opportunities at the industry level. So at a starting point, we generally lean on existing standards and frameworks, such as the SASB and TCFD, both for public and private markets. We also recognize that the materiality of ESG factors may vary dependent on geography, industry, and asset class. So we take a pragmatic view to applying a responsible investment approach across asset classes. As an example, for internally managed public investments, we conduct an in-depth ESG due diligence that is integrated in the fundamental thesis and considered alongside traditional financial factors. For private markets, the ESG due diligence is really tailored dependent upon the type of opportunity, geography, and industry. In order also to support our approach with more data-driven insight, we developed a proprietary ESG score that is aligned with the SASB standard classification. And essentially, we systematically monitor ESG risk and opportunities for public listed equities using the SASB standard classification to really develop industry relevant, comparable benchmark for each of the companies in our portfolios. And last but not least, to ensure that our ESG integration approach is also aligned with our responsible investment policy, we developed a proprietary ESG assessment framework to evaluate the maturity of ESG integration practices for our external managers and general partners. And basically score them in a quartile ranking. And with the development of our ESG composite score for public markets, in addition to evaluating the maturity of their practices, we're now also able to measure their performance on governance scores and ESG scores relative to their own benchmark. So this really helps us engage with them on specific company examples, for example.
It's a really interesting kind of behind the scenes look at how a pension fund manager or a pension fund works, and in terms of due diligence around your managers as well as your own portfolios. And I want to just focus on this for a moment and make it very clear to our audience how you're using the SASB mapping. Because on the one hand, this is a webinar about corporate reporting, but you're applying the SASB materiality mapping, whether or not companies are reporting using the SASB standards, right? You're filtering the raw data, you're assessing performance and weighting investments according to the SASB materiality mapping. That said, do you also encourage companies to report using SASB standards? Does that make for a more direct and accurate picture for your investment research and engagement?
Absolutely. And as you may have seen, PSP joined the 8th largest Canadian pension plan last November in issuing a statement essentially emphasizing that it was crucial for us to have access to comparable and consistent ESG information to inform investment decision and assess exposure to ESG risk. So the statement while it recognized that companies face a myriad of disclosure standards and frameworks, also emphasized the crucial importance of having access to standardized ESG data and asked for companies to report by adopting the TCFD framework and SASB standards. And most recently, also in June, we participated in another joint statement in response to the SEC's request for input on climate change disclosure, reiterating support for reporting alongside the TCFD framework and SASB standards, but also emphasizing the importance of the timely development of disclosure guidance for ESG information.
Excellent. Okay, that was indeed a strong statement from Canada's Maple 8 back in fall 2020. And so, what we hear is something similar that we hear from investors around the world and increasingly regulators is TCFD and SASB aligned disclosure, TCFD for climate risk and for industry-specific metrics, SASB. Now, turning back to your ESG research, and one of the challenges around ESG is that a lot of the disclosure is backwards looking. How do you incorporate dynamic materiality in your ESG scoring to try to assess future performance?
It's interesting, and so definitely our framework seeks to be agile and reflective of the dynamic nature of materiality. And we recently enhanced the methodology for the calculation of our composite score to include a dynamic category weighting of each of the SASB general issue category to have more of a forward-looking view on our corporate scoring methodology. So the dynamic weighting uses an artificial intelligence screening tool that captures an article, the volume of article for each of the general issue categories. And we found that this tool really helps us identify and monitor emerging risk and opportunities, and also detect change in trends in stakeholder perception, which can have an impact on valuation over the long term. So in addition to having industry relevant benchmark, this dynamic ESG scoring methodology also helps us having a unique company signature based on their set of circumstances on the materiality of ESG, depending on their business model.
It's really fascinating. And we will be, we're preparing a case study about PSP that we'll be publishing in the coming weeks, I believe. So we'll look out for that coming out from the Value Reporting Foundation. Now, lastly, Anne-Marie, in terms of engagement with companies, how does your ESG scoring guide, let's go into more detail about how your ESG scoring affects your engagement process in terms of which companies you're targeting and what you engage on?
For sure, and engagement is a big part of our process. We promote good governance practices and engage with companies on material ESG issues. And in order to encourage positive change and steer capitals towards value creation opportunities, our approach to engagement is continuous, constructive, and focused on material ESG risk and opportunities. So when we look to engage with companies, we look at companies where we have, in public markets, where we have a debt or equity position, and prioritize the engagement on our ability to achieve successful outcome, considering the size of our holdings and the materiality of ESG factors. And as an example, and a preview maybe to the case study, we recently did an analysis of the transportation sector to identify potential outliers. So we first started by looking at companies with a 3-year decline in their corporate governance score, and then applied a screen on our ESG materiality score, and identified one specific outlier that had a very high weighting, way higher than the industry average on employee health and safety exposure. So this prompted us to do a more in-depth analysis of prior controversies on these issues, which surfaced a track record of prior unsafe labor practices. So we then looked at, with our research team, at the fundamentals, and it was interesting that we noted lower employee productivity for that specific company and a lower ROE than the average of the peer group. So this type of analysis helps us frame our engagement process with industry relevant benchmark and informed view of best practices and specific KPIs that we can track over the engagement process.
It's a really interesting look into this asset owner, pension fund, and pension fund manager. Anne-Marie, thank you. It's, often companies feel like they're reporting all this ESG data, but they don't quite know what happens to it next. And you've really given us a clear picture of how you're using ESG data in your processes. So thank you very much, Anne-Marie. We're going to now go to a conversation between my colleague Katie and Bruno. Katie, let me hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, and really great overview. Thanks so much, Anne-Marie and Neil. So Bruno, over to you as an asset manager who is in the service of asset owners like PSP and so many others. How does UBS incorporate the materiality map of SASB standards in its investment process?
And Bruno, could you try to turn on your camera? I don't believe it's on just now.
It says the host has turned it off, so I think you need to be doing something at your end there.
Okay.
There we go. Let's see if it works.
There we go.
Okay, great. So the materiality map is a really important part of our approach to assessing how companies rank on material metrics that fit into the sustainability realm. And let me talk about that for a second. So, of course, I'm an active investor. I'm a team leader with a lot of colleagues that focus on the integration of material sustainability data and investment processes. And the materiality map is kind of a guidebook, or if you like, an architecture that helps us focus on, well, what are the relevant things that we should be looking at when we're evaluating a company for inclusion in a portfolio. And the reason it's so useful and important is because the materiality map is organized largely along industry relevant topics. And so, just to illustrate the point, if you're trying to understand a software company, and everyone knows that's a knowledge-driven kind of business, the ability to keep and retain human capital, the talented programmers and other software engineers at the company, well, that's where the value of the company really resides. And financial metrics alone aren't going to help you with that. And so the industry-specific metrics tied to human capital play a large part in our assessment, because studies show that obviously when the talent leaves, the value goes away. Conversely, if you're looking at a manufacturing company, say in basic materials, where energy input is a major cost of producing the product, well, looking at industry relevant metrics around energy, the environment, and industrial waste will tell you how the company ranks among its peers on these important metrics. And of course, financial metrics are important, but obviously an energy efficient producer of steel is going to produce better margins and have a better cost structure than its competitors. So what we would say is the materiality map and the data that we collect in our proprietary database from both internal and external sources complements our mosaic of data that we use to evaluate companies and decide whether we want to allocate our clients' capital to them.
Excellent, and a great way of sort of defanging an issue to demonstrate how energy efficiency really contributes to the bottom line or can erode performance there. So a lot of people don't always make those connections. So thanks for that. How do you see the standardization of ESG disclosure in comparison to financial reporting? And does it benefit companies as well as investors?
Oh yeah, it most certainly does. And all you have to do is look across to see what's happened with financial data over the last 25 or 30 years to make the point. So I guess I'm old enough that I started in the business when we had a pretty disorderly set of financial metrics. None of it was machine readable. You collected it by hand. And frankly, back then, just collecting company level data was an informational advantage because it was hard to get. And what's more, it was messy. So you had to keep adjusting data from different sources and different regions to make it apples to apples. And over the years, what happened? Well, first, the Financial Accounting Standards Board became the go-to for public company reporting in the US. The SEC empowered it as being the arbiter for materiality. And then in 2003, I believe the Norwalk Agreement aligned FASB metrics with non-US metrics. And now we're in a world where financial metrics around the world are really well aligned, pretty transparent. You have to spend very little time making adjustments, and the ease of use is tremendous. And what we're seeing is exactly the same play out with sustainability data. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board kind of laid out the materiality map, and now we're on the verge of what I would call global convergence, where standards are coming together. It's going to become simpler and easier for companies to zero in on what they should be reporting. They're going to have good indicators for materiality. It's going to be down to them to make the final decision on materiality. But obviously, a common standard, a common language makes for a transparent and efficient capital markets. And I would say to company management that this is going to make your job a lot easier. You're going to know exactly what to focus on, what to spend your resources on, what you should be looking at internally, and working with either internal help or with your auditors to put together information that helps clarify where your company stands in terms of material sustainability metrics. So this is a good outcome, I think.
Couldn't agree more. So in your view, why is industry specificity important? So for example, asset managers measuring and communicating portfolio alignment and other topics related to that. Why is that important for you?
Well, Katie, interestingly, there is a little bit of, I think, a misconception that all financial metrics are equally material. That's definitely not the case, right? If you're looking at a retailer, for instance, inventory turns are probably one of the most important pieces of information that you're going to look at. And if you look at a software company, inventory turns are going to be a lot less relevant. So whether people realize it or not, investors, portfolio managers, and the markets prioritize certain elements of financial data because they're more relevant to explaining a particular business. And the same thing goes on with sustainability data. Not much point in looking at the energy efficiency of knowledge-based companies because they often have no physical assets to speak of. You're going to look at other things. And so it's exactly the same as financial data. The market zeroes in on what are the metrics that are most relevant for understanding the industry and stacks them up in order of importance, relevance in terms of explaining how the business model generates value for shareholders and the external world. And so industry relevant metrics are, in a way, revealing the way that investors focus in on the most important aspects of the way a business model actually functions.
Terrific. So you're a founding member, or not you personally, but UBS is a founding member of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative. What does UBS want to see in companies' climate disclosures, and is their present carbon footprint useful to asset managers thinking about their portfolios on a forward-looking basis?
Yes, absolutely. So, and in a full reveal, I'm also on the task force for climate-related financial disclosure. So, what are we looking for? Well, I think investors are trying to understand a couple things. The first is, well, if a company is a major user of energy, in other words, if it's got a big carbon footprint, whether it's producing a carbon footprint or using inputs that generate carbon, well, we know that for us to reach Paris Agreement goals, that companies have to adjust what they do with their business model. And so investors are trying to see, is the company on track to achieving business goals that align with the Paris Agreement? And that's also industry specific, right? A company with a very light carbon footprint because it doesn't have any hard assets is going to find it pretty easy. A company in a basic materials industry should be measured against its relevant peers, and the market wants to see if it's moving along. There's also the subject of carbon taxes and the cost of carbon in many jurisdictions, not in the US, but elsewhere. And so investors want to see, is the company going to benefit by generating carbon credits, or does it have to get carbon credits to meet its regulatory obligations? So it's really just part of the big picture where companies operate in the real world. Are they users or emitters? And being able to measure and report on your own carbon data is extremely relevant for investors to see how the company is going to play out over the long run. And I would point out that companies that achieve successful transitions often get premium valuations. We've seen this in the utility industry. So note to management, this isn't just a sideshow. This will influence how the market looks at your company's viability and valuations over the long run.
No, absolutely. And I think that fact is so often lost in the mix and the swirl of standards, frameworks, disclosure, questionnaires, and so on. And it really is, investors, active managers, and index fund managers are really honing in on these topics as important matters that are influencing their investment decisions, their voting decisions, and so on. I think, unfortunately, we're out of time, so we're going to skip the last question that we had prepared for you, but you sort of touched upon this. Investors calling for SASB and TCFD aligned disclosure. So I think we are on time. And with that, I will hand it back to Neil after thanking you very much, Bruno, for all of your support and eloquence on today's webinar.
Indeed, Bruno, thank you very much. That was a great conversation and a look at one of the world's largest asset managers and how you're viewing the SASB materiality mapping, and particularly some very interesting points about climate. Let's go on now to hearing from Katie, and this is going to be the kind of the view now from the standard setter. So we've heard about how what investors want and why investors are asking companies to implement SASB. Let's hear how SASB looks at this, the big picture, and really connects investors and companies on the financial impacts of sustainability.
Thank you so much. So if we move to the next slide, as I mentioned, I lead our investor advisory group, which is comprised of 58 members, 40% of which are asset owners, 60% of which are asset managers, with over $48 trillion in assets based on US dollars. Investor advisory group members represent 12 countries, 40% of which are domiciled outside the US, which is sometimes surprising to people. 9 of the world's 10 largest asset managers are members of the IAG, 16 of the largest 20, and 3 of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds are also members of the Investor Advisory Group. Next slide. So why is that important? The Investor Advisory Group updated its statement last year to call upon portfolio companies to disclose their ESG performance to investors using SASB standards. They outlined a number of reasons. I won't read all of these to you today in the interest of time, but they've laid out very well, I think, the rationale behind their call for SASB disclosure, including industry specificity, our focus on financial materiality. And importantly, the IAG noted that in their view, other standards and frameworks complement SASB standards, but shouldn't be thought of as replacements for them. And this is something that we have been working on a lot over the last 18 months or so, which is really to help the world understand that we need a building block approach to ESG disclosure, and a foundational piece of that building block system for a comprehensive global system for reporting should rest upon the bedrock of financial materiality, and SASB standards provide that view. So next slide, please. So the Investor Advisory Group is an extraordinary group of individuals who are very committed, but they are very much on trend, if you will, looking at this Google Trends view of references to ESG, impact investing, socially responsible investing that the CFA Institute published, I believe it was last year. And we see that this is a very, very hot topic. If we move on to the next slide, please. We also see that investors have been signing this, the principles of responsible investing in droves from its founding in 2006 to 2020. PRI signatories as of June 2020 were just close to 3,000 signatories with massive assets under management. This is really table stakes right now to sign the principles of responsible investing. Why is this important? Among the 6 things that all PRI signatories agree to is the incorporation of ESG considerations into all of their investment decision making. So not a sliver of a portfolio, not a socially responsible, labeled fund or whatnot. Every PRI signatory commits to the incorporation of ESG considerations into every investment decision. So moving on to the next slide. Why is that? Why are investors so interested in this? We've seen a complete inversion, if you will, of tangible to intangible asset value amongst S&P 500 companies. And this is true, I think, across global economies, where in 1975, only 17% of assets were intangible. The other 80%, you could go kick the tires, visit the warehouse, review the inventory. You could hold it in your hands, if you will. Whereas today, only 10% of the market value of S&P 500 companies is attributable to tangible assets. Everything else is intangible. And ESG considerations or ESG factors can really affect that intangible value. So that is among the many reasons that investors are really dialing in on these things. So if we move on to the next slide, we see that while nearly all G250 companies are producing sustainability reports, so that's very good news. Moving ahead, investors really remain dissatisfied with the quality of the information available to them. If we can have another click here, you'll see that investor satisfaction or dissatisfaction with ESG considerations, it's very low levels of satisfaction. Only 29% of investors are satisfied with the quality of sustainability related information, and only 8% believe that this data is comparable. We move on to the next slide. Why is that? Much of ESG disclosure today, despite these high levels of disclosure, remains binary. They are yes/no answers to questions really related to policy. Do you have a policy in place on labor conditions in the supply chain, and so on and so forth? That's very difficult for an investor in 2021 to find decision useful. It was probably useful 5 years ago, but investors have really advanced their understanding of the importance of these issues on their portfolio companies, and they want comparable, consistent, and reliable data, not just this binary data. If we move on to the next slide, we also see, getting into the detail, the top 5 challenges of the usefulness and effectiveness of ESG disclosure. Found by an EY survey that was conducted in 2020. So a disconnect between ESG reporting and mainstream financial information is the #1 challenge that investors find with this information. And that is really where SASB standards come into play. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that study. Getting to the standardization, I'm moving on to the next slide. Without standards, companies are using an array of metrics when they are using metrics to describe the same thing. So this is an example from something that was published in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance. I think it was 4 things no one will tell you about ESG data. So looking at 50 large publicly listed companies, this study found 24 different metrics that were used to describe one factor, employee health and safety. So again, one factor, 24 different ways that 50 companies were using to describe their performance on employee health and safety. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see why investors are really frustrated, as well as companies. When we have different units of measure to describe the same thing, we've got things that are measured in numerically as percentages. The distribution of those of that disclosure results in overlaps between leaders and laggards on, looking just at three things: injury rates, the number of accidents with fatal consequences, and financial loss due to accidents, you see an overlap between leaders and laggards, again, on just this one factor. So moving on to the next slide, it's not surprising that without standards, we see real confusion when it comes to the ratings and rankings of companies on ESG performance. And this is from the Wall Street Journal, probably about 2 years ago, that shows you for these 5 companies shown here, vast differences between how, based on this sort of noisy information that is being reported, not using standards, that you find, a company rated very highly via one rater or ranker and very low by another. So that is the value of standards. So moving on to the next slide. Again, I feel like I'm flogging a dead horse, but lack of standards makes evaluating performance on critical issues really challenging. So we can see here, if we click through, that this is just for, again, one factor, which is energy intensity in the extractive sector. So you can see that we've got a variety of different ways that companies in the extractive sector are reporting their energy intensity. So it's all over the map. It's very difficult for an investor to take that information and compare apples to apples of companies in that sector. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that standards can really help the investors make sense out of the enterprise value at the industry level. So you can clearly note disparities between performance amongst companies on the same issues. So you can see the example here where you're looking at energy consumed in megawatt hours over extracted ore in tons, using the same standardized disclosure. You can easily spot low energy efficiency and high energy efficiency right off the bat without doing any gymnastics. So moving on to the next slide, SASB is really helping meet unmet market needs, which is why we have such strong investor support. We see just such strong investor momentum, investors using the standards. There are 223 firms in 22 countries with over 70 trillion in assets that are either members of SASB's alliance and or are licensing SASB IP. Why is that important? Moving on to the next slide, it shows that SASB is being integrated into the investment decision-making of investors around the world. And you can learn more about that by looking at the ESG Integration Insights case study series, which we've been publishing since 2016. And in fact, Bruno was one of the first contributors to that publication. And in fact, there are 2 UBS case studies in the series. We have over 20 case studies now where you can look at investor use of SASB standards in investment decision-making from asset owners, asset managers, active, index, public, private, equity, debt, I could go on, and to really show what they're actually doing and how they're going into further detail than you've heard from Anne-Marie and Bruno today, how they're incorporating these things into investment decision-making. A number of prominent asset managers have also actually built products around with SASB standards at their core. So again, we're seeing SASB become embedded into market infrastructure. And then moving on to the next slide, we hear from companies, we hear from investors what they find are really best practices for companies using the standards in their communication. So context is very important, how the business is managing topics according to the standards. It's most useful when companies not only report performance data, but also explain how the business is managing SASB topics as opportunities or as risks. Focus is another key area that investors find valuable. Separating investor relevant content from content that is relevant to stakeholders makes it easier for investors to find and use the information that is most useful to them. Convenience is another factor cited by investors, or what they see is a best practice. So most reports include, for current reporters, include a SASB table of metrics, easy to find, easy to access. You can just flip the page and know where to find the data. Those with data provided alongside the metric are easier for investors to use than those that refer to a page number, in some other report or publication. Reliability is something that investors value. When companies include third-party assurance of their report, it's noticed by the investor, and investors universally praise that. So seek out assurance when you have the quality of the data and the internal systems of control that are necessary to make you comfortable with that. Authenticity is another thing that investors really appreciate. They really appreciate reports that present an honest view that isn't quote unquote overly flowery or self-serving, which is something that we've heard. And all of these comments come from a corporate investor dialogue series that the SASB Alliance has been convening. So this is an exact quote. Investors don't want overly flowery or self-serving, but rather matter of fact about the challenges they face and that their industry faces. They want to know how you are managing these thorny issues. So with that, Neil, I think I'm at the end of my time and the end of my slides. Just one more thing. We do have a growing component of market data infrastructure that we have mapped to dozens of data analytics providers, mapped to SASB standards, and are using the standards in their work. So I know I'm a little bit over time, and I want to hand this back to you.
Not at all. Stay with us, Katie. We're going to go on to Q&A now, and I'd ask Bruno and Anne-Marie to rejoin us as well. But Katie, thank you very much for giving us that real whistle-stop tour through some of both the historical body of research, but also the most current research into ESG and performance, and making those connections and really seeing why companies as well as investors need standards. So let's go now to Q&A, and we've been getting good questions from the audience. And the first question we got was for Anne-Marie. While you were talking, Anne-Marie, we got a question coming in, and this goes to the question of, well, how do you balance out some of the issues and how are they changing? For example, you mentioned dynamic materiality. So over the last year, how have you seen COVID affect the balance of, say, social and human capital issues?
A great question. Actually, if we monitored the relative weighting of each of the SASB general issue categories for both our developed market and emerging markets portfolio, and if we looked as an example at the market cap adjusted weighting of the general issue categories for our developed market benchmark, we noticed that employee diversity and inclusion was in the top 3. So social considerations are really come in the forefront, and something that we have noticed by looking at the progression and evolution of our ESG assessment framework. What I would say in response to that, what we have done over the course of the most recent years also increase the number of engagements we've been doing with investee companies on social related factors, including employee diversity, inclusion, human capital management, and human rights.
Great, thank you, Anne-Marie. Now a question for you, Bruno, for UBS. And the question here is, how do investors use the data to assess large companies versus smaller companies? And this is a common question. Smaller companies often feel that they might be at a disadvantage. They don't have the resources, the personnel. Are they at a disadvantage? And for that matter, the questioner here wonders if for smaller companies, can even small changes have make a big impact in terms of the assessment that you make of them?
Sure. Well, I think what you're identifying is a level of bias in terms of the depth and breadth of data that's being reported by companies. And this isn't just a large company, small company issue. There are regional differences, right? Developed markets typically have companies that report more data. And that's true of financial data as well, I might point out. So one of the importance of having an experienced investment staff and thinking about how companies report is that we can adjust the numbers or talk to the company about data that they ought to report that wouldn't make their case that they're should be well ranked on sustainability issues. But definitely large companies have more resources and probably report more data. When we assess companies, though, from a sustainability perspective, we're well aware of this bias and we adjust for it. So we think it through. And so that means that a small company with less data would largely be compared to other similar smaller companies within the same industry in terms of their level of reporting. This is probably at an extreme when you have an IPO, right, where there's almost no data and you've got to really talk to the company and understand its business model to assess its sustainability profile. But that's part of the challenge of making good investment decisions.
Indeed. And let me follow up with a question, Bruno, that I often see as a kind of companion to that one, and that's about emerging markets. And is ESG equally important in emerging markets? And do you need to use a kind of different scale or measure for emerging markets companies, considering different human capital or social issues or environmental for that matter?
Well, it might even be more important because of the some of the issues that you point out, right? And for example, many companies in emerging markets are actually located in low-lying areas of the world that are subject to flooding, have inadequate infrastructure, and that's something you want to think through. Think back to the flooding in Thailand that put the disk drive industry out of commission for quite a long time. So these are very important issues to understand and to assess. And that said, emerging market companies have varying levels of reporting and depth and quality to their reporting. Obviously, companies in what I would call very advanced emerging markets like Korea, for example, have really good data by and large. And then you can go to frontier markets or the frontier end of emerging markets, and obviously you'll have less data. What investors would love would be equal level of reporting and accuracy across all markets, developed and emerging. I think that'll happen over time. That said, financial data in small emerging markets isn't as accurate or as deep as you'll find it in an established developed market. Part of that is the regulatory framework. But we know how to make these adjustments and make good decisions despite these issues.
Excellent. Thanks, Bruno. A question for you, Katie, and this is a question about greenwashing. And the questioner points out that sometimes sustainability reports themselves can be kind of used for greenwashing. In your experience, how can we get further traction on using comparable metrics to provide more in-depth data rather than higher level rather just high level information, and to prevent greenwashing? So a question really about standards and greenwashing.
Well, I think that's the importance of standards right there. I think in the early days of sustainability reporting, people were really interested in telling the good stories, that hitting all the high notes, and that's also important. And there are stakeholders who want to know, all of the great things that companies are doing, and there's a tremendous amount of value there. But when we look back on the things that investors value most, when we were looking at the results of the corporate investor dialogues of the SASB Alliance, for example, investors want to hear the struggles and how you're coping with them. So I think the standards help provide a common sort of baseline data that investors use to compare companies across the board in an industry or industries. And then, you can build upon that and keep on going with, the good news stories, but they want to know and want to be able to compare, apples to apples based on standards. And I think, maybe Bruno and Anne-Marie are better suited to opine further upon that. But I think, the simple answer here is that the standards are a great antidote for greenwashing, in my view.
Well, perhaps Anne-Marie and Bruno, you might want to weigh in on that. And again, so there's greenwashing, and the other colorful word we like to use is cherry picking, where companies are just reporting the good and ignoring the bad. Are you on the watch for that? And do you see ESG reporting maturing to the point where we're getting past greenwashing and cherry picking? Anne-Marie?
I think Katie summed it up really well, in that further transparency creates accountability mechanisms that we can use as investors to identify potential risk of greenwashing. So having transparency on actual company performance and trend is critical. And as Katie also mentioned, what is even more important than the the baseline of disclosure, or equally as important as the baseline of disclosure, is the direction and the trajectory of the performance. So to the extent we're able to also capture an improvement in performance or be able to explain a deterioration in performance is also a very important decision useful information that can be achieved with more transparency and consistency in reporting.
Very good. And Bruno, this is one of the things that we addressed a little bit earlier when Katie was talking about what investors like and dislike about reporting. And one of the things that investors point out is when companies are using the SASB standards for reporting, they want to make sure that if they are omitting a metric, that they indicate that and say why. How does that context or color, the rationale for not reporting a metric, help you in your view of a company?
Well, it can be the company's business model. A particular metric for that industry isn't material or relevant, and so commentary around that helps us understand how the business works a bit better and make good decisions about it. So, we say in our business the numbers don't lie, and so if you have a strong sustainability profile and you report everything that you think is material that's aligned with the materiality map, makes it easy for us to assess the company. And we'll look at the data. Of course, we'll read the commentary. That's important too. But commentary with no data, that kind of flashes a little bit of a yellow light for us. That means that is it all talk and no action? We're interested in data that supports the commentary and paints a complete picture of what the company's all about.
Great, thank you. Now, another question for you, Anne-Marie, and this goes back to something that Katie and Bruno talked a little bit more about, and that's the convergence of reporting standards and frameworks. And the question here is, how does the current state of fragmented reporting requirements and the range of standards frameworks affect your ability, PSB's ability, to integrate ESG information? Perhaps it must make it different to have these disparate sources of or structures, frameworks of data. How supportive are you of convergence efforts towards a more simple, coherent sustainability disclosure system?
So great question. As we mentioned during the panel, we are very supportive of standardization of ESG disclosure aligned with existing standards and frameworks such as SASB and TCFD. And we do have disparity in disclosure levels at the moment, which was one of the key reasons why we developed our ESG composite score using proxies. So using artificial intelligence tools and also underlying categories of risk management at the category level to generate some proxies around the quality of and maturity of practices, of sustainability practices at the issuer level. And we support that scoring. Obviously, it's not an exercise that's done in isolation. We complement this score with company disclosure, and we prefer to use company disclosure in our analysis. But we are able at the moment to bridge that gap by developing our own methodology using some proxies and third-party scores.
And Anne-Marie, another question for you, and that is about engagement with companies and directors. So if you're meeting with a company, do you expect to meet with an independent director or chair? And if so, what kind of fluency in ESG KPIs do you expect them to have? Should they be familiar, for example, with the SASB standard for their industry?
Absolutely. And the range of company representatives we engage with tend to be diverse, but typically we would engage with board representatives, either the chair, but in some instances also with independent directors or chair of specific committees, example, compensation or nomination. We are, in addition to corporate governance matters, we also address sustainability reporting and climate change reporting with board members, and do expect that they are well versed in the frameworks, reporting, and the KPIs that are discussed and monitored at the board level to create these accountability mechanisms around sustainability issues.
Excellent. And Katie, last quick question for you before we wrap up, and this is about implementing the SASB standards. And should companies be doing and even reporting on their own materiality assessment process, or is following the standard or standards for their industry or industries enough?
company management is always best suited to determine the factors that are likely to be material for that company and for their investors. So the materiality map can be a great sort of, aerial view of what's likely to be material in your industry or the industries in which a company operates, but it's always up to management to do the analysis. This is not about reporting for reporting's sake. This is about really demonstrating that you've got a handle on the issues that are most likely to affect the enterprise value of your business. So great on-ramp, but shouldn't be the final destination, would be my short answer.
Excellent answer. Thanks, Katie. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of this third episode in our 2021 SASB implementation webinar series. I hope you'll all join me next week at the same time when we just talk about disclosure quality, including data governance, internal controls, and assurance with SASB Standards Board members, Suzanne Stormer and Dan Gelser. If you're listening now, you're already registered. But if you have colleagues who would be interested, please pass on the registration link. For all your questions answered or to reach SASB staff, please go to SASB's new help portal, help.sasb.org. And for a step-by-step guide to adopting SASB standards, as we've referred to a number of times, see our implementation primer. Right now, I want to thank our live audience for tuning in and for your many excellent questions. I particularly want to thank Anne-Marie Monette from TSP in Montreal, Bruno Bertocci from UBS Asset Management, and my colleague Katie Schmitz-Hewlett joining us from San Francisco. I'm Neil Stewart with the Value Reporting Foundation. Goodbye.